Okay, welcome back from your break. We have a very special guest who's joining us remotely this morning. He is very well known in our community, and this is apropos to the previous talk. I'm going to connect his audio. I'm going to connect his video. Oops. And I need the adapter for the video. 1 second. We have Jordan Mechner live with us today. Let's see, can you turn his sound? Is his sound?
Oh, sorry, the sound is not on. Now it's on.
Let's see if we can hear you.
Hey! Try talking.
Oh,
no.
Oh, hey!
Still no
You keep
sound?
losing him on the screen. So maybe just sit.
Why don't you put the computer facing us?
Okay, try talking now. Can you hear? Can we hear?
We heard him for a second.
We had Ron.
There you go.
I'm just going to leave the computer here.
Okay. Well, I saw everybody once. Well, so is it true that the talk that came just before was about making Karateka run in 2-player mode?
Yes.
That's amazing. Well, I'm really glad to be talking to you guys. It's kind of good timing because I just started this kind of odd little project. I kept journals while I was making my games on the Apple II 30, 35 years ago, and I'm actually digging into my archives, which are at the Strong Museum of Play in New York, looking for visuals to support an illustrated edition of those journals. This is kind of like the text, mostly text version that's that I put online a few years ago. So Stripe Press was interested in doing it as a real book. So it's been kind of a walk down memory lane. I've got this. I've been looking through my hard drive of, all kinds of crazy stuff that I just had in boxes in my garage for decades, and I've never really looked at, And so now I'm pulling it out, going through them, and I think I found some stuff that I think probably very few people outside of the people in this room, will be interested in or appreciate. But it's stuff that hasn't been seen, at least in a long time. So I thought I would share it with you. I'm going to try screen sharing here. See if give me a sign if this works. Okay, so this was my Bible, when I was about 20 years old. It was an article in Micro Magazine that explained what all the memory locations in the Apple II were used for. And there's, it's probably too blurry to see, but at least you can see how dog-eared this article was. I carried it around literally for 10 years. While making Karateka and Prince of Persia. This is the thing that told me which page 0 locations I could use, and which ones were dangerous. And this is what the code looked like at the time. I'm a little rusty on the 6502 assembly language, but I do notice that this is written in the mini assembler, which is you guys see a show of hands of how many people here in this room have done programming at some point using the mini assembler? Wow. This is a special gathering indeed. Yeah, so obviously, it's a matter of this, it didn't have variable names. I had to just enter it directly into the mini assembler, and in some cases just go in and change the hex codes to edit the code. So backing up, this was, I started with the Apple II when I was in high school and then in college. And my first ambitious project, after I'd kind of figured out how to program in BASIC and the basics of assembly language and was starting to work in high-res graphics, was I wanted to reverse engineer a clone of the arcade game Asteroids. So the most, what I thought was the best Apple II game at this time was Apple Invaders, which I had on cassette, and it was a real. Everybody here play that? A lot of people play Apple Invaders. Yeah. I mean, it amazed me because it was the only Apple game that seemed identical to the arcade version. It didn't look like a cheap reverse engineered copy. It actually seemed like whoever had made it had, must have had access to the actual arcade game or something. Maybe one of you actually knows more about the history of that than I do, but just as a kid playing this game, I was super impressed. And I thought, okay, if somebody did that for Space Invaders, I'd like to do it for what was, by then, we're talking, by now we're 1980, the most popular arcade game was Asteroids. So I went to the arcade with some graph paper and and I did my best to copy the shape of the rocks that was on the screen because I didn't want to just do like any random rock shapes. I really wanted it to look like the arcade game. And I was thinking, in high school, if I can do that, that's going to be sort of my ticket into the video game industry. This will be something that people will want to play. So here's the page where I did the shapes for the rotating ship. Now, the thing is, of course, the arcade game of Asteroids used vector graphics, which I didn't have. So it's maybe not the most ideal fit to the Apple's capabilities, but I did my best. And the small and the medium-sized rocks. And those are the shapes for the ship when it explodes. The little vectors break up. So the actual discs of the Asteroids, the last version that I got working is in the Strong's collection. So it'd be interesting to play that, see how it holds up. But I actually finished the game, got it working, and found a publisher who was willing to publish it, Hayden Book Company, the publishers of Sargon, the strongest Apple II chess program at that time. But unfortunately, soon after we signed the contract, my first real publishing contract, the Atari sent letters to the top publishers saying basically game over. You can't rip off our arcade games and publish your own reverse engineered clones of them anymore. So Asteroids, although it was finished, was never published. This was a blow, but I went on. And the next program that I set out to write, this is now 1982, I'm a freshman in college, is a game that was like Asteroids, but different enough that Atari's lawyers wouldn't have a problem with it. And here's some of the first sketches for this. This is the font that I laboriously copied the font that was used in arcade machines at that time. I don't know why, it was important to me to get the font down like to the pixel so that it would look just like a coin-op game, but I did, and I was very proud of that. And here's some of the code for Death Bounce, as the game was eventually titled. And it was kind of like a mix between Asteroids and Pool. You had a spaceship, you would move it around, and instead of shooting at space rocks, you were shooting at bouncing colored billiard balls that would bounce off the edges of the screen instead of passing through. And if you can see closely enough on the screen, you can see that this is a huge technological advance. I'm now using the mini assembler. I'm using the SC assembler, which has variable names and so forth. So this is sort of proper assembler code at this point. The SC assembler was kind of my first professional tool. And one of the other things I found in the archive here was the manual for the SC assembler. Anyone recognize that? I mean, seeing this, this was like Proust's Madeline for me. You know, that light blue cover just brought it all back. This is 3.2. This is before we upgraded to DOS 3.3. This is the 1979 version. I just stopped on this page at the appendix because this was a list of the books that were available at that time on how to program the 6502 and how to understand the Apple. And I was, you know, obviously this is, you know, not having the internet and not really having any friends in New York where I lived who knew about this stuff. All of these resources were really precious. So I was kind of having to figure out, you know, reverse engineer the stuff that, you know, the people who were writing and programming published games already knew. So this brings me to 1982. And once again, Death Bounce, despite the high hopes that I had for it, did not get published. I sent it to Broderbund Software, my favorite publisher, and Doug Carlston, the president of the company, responded that it seemed well programmed, the animation was smooth, but the industry had kind of moved on, and that their best-selling game at the time was Choplifter. I assume everyone in the room knows Choplifter. I didn't at this time. I actually thought he said shoplifter. I imagined a game where you were going around stealing stuff from store shelves. But Doug was kind enough to send me a copy of the game, along with a joystick, a TG joystick to play it, because this was the first game, as far as I knew, that actually required a joystick, which I didn't have. You couldn't play it with the game paddles or the keyboard. And you know, Choplifter blew me away, not just with the the animation, the smoothness, the physics behind the helicopter's movement, but also the fact that it told a story. You know, it wasn't just kind of open-ended trying to get points and get extra lives like Space Invaders and Asteroids in every arcade game I've played until then. It had 64 lives of hostages, and if you saved all 64, that was a perfect score and it was the end. And if they were all either rescued or lost, it was still the end. Not game over, the end. That was very powerful to me, that little difference, that here was a game that had a human connection. You know, the little hostages waved to you. They wanted to be rescued. So this kind of made me think, wow, what have I been doing for the last 4 years? I've been trying to copy arcade games when here we have this personal computer. You know, we have it in our house. We can, you know, when we buy a game on a disc, we own it. There's no reason to try to follow a game design model that's made to make us put in quarters. You know, we can actually have a finite experience that gives satisfaction. That's it's sort of a different medium. It's a different form than the coin-op game. So having seen Choplifter, I set aside everything I'd been doing. I forgot about Death Bounce, and I started making a new game, which here I found some of the early sketches, and this is stuff that I hadn't seen in so long. Is that showing up there? Yeah. So these are my early sketches for Karateka, and my reference. I was looking at a book of how to do karate, photographs of karatekas and various moves, and I was this is sort of my drawing ability at the time. I copied the stances, and so I started putting these into the computer as a one of the models was a Swashbuckler, a game, sort of a sword fighting game. Do y'all remember Swashbuckler? Anybody play that? Yeah, that had large characters on the screen, and it's sort of a pirate theme, so that really impressed me. So I thought if I could do characters that big but with fluid animation, that would be cool. that would be engaging. But the problem that I had when I started trying to create these animations, as you saw from those graph paper sketches, is that it just didn't look good at all. It looked choppy. It didn't fit the image that I had in my head. The fact is I didn't know how to do animation. I wasn't a trained animator. I could appreciate good animation. You know, I loved Disney films, and you know, Ralph Bakshi was around, but I just wasn't at that level of skill. So I tried something which actually, I found out later, it's something that Ralph Bakshi and the early Disney animators had actually done. They just didn't advertise it. They filmed actors doing the moves that they wanted to animate, and then they used that film as reference. But they went beyond using it as reference. They actually, in some cases, traced the frames, a device called rotoscoping. And so that's what I did. I filmed on Super 8 film. Here, let's get back to the screen sharing. Yeah, that's the tracing of the first rotoscope frame of Karateka. It's my karate teacher. I filmed on Super 8 film, projected the film onto a moviola, you know, editing tool, which had a crank which you could turn and stop on a specific frame. And I traced it with tracing paper with a pencil. Here's the next frame. And the next. You can see, it's interesting looking at it now because I made little notes. This note says that the belt swings. And that here's the regular stance. You know, I found where the center was. Then I noted that when he pulls back his arm, the belt moves back, and then when he punches, the belt moves forward. So it was, you know, obviously there was no digitized, there was no video in on the Apple II. It was a matter of like tracing these outlines and then kind of painstakingly, pixel by pixel, using something called the VersaWriter, which Roberta Williams had actually used to do the graphics for the first Sierra games, but which used the two potentiometers of the game paddles as a kind of a pantograph so that you could trace a hand-drawn image like this one, and it would kind of give you a rough, jittery version of that on the screen, which I would then clean up using pixel editing tools which I also found in the archives. But we only have half an hour, so I won't get into the the version of Photoshop that I had to try to build in 1980. It had a limited feature set, but it was good enough to create these shapes and get them into the Apple II, and then to alternate them, create the illusion of movement. So that was the Rotoscope 1.0, and that was Karateka, and I worked on that game for a few years. I'm just going to skip forward now. Everything I've been talking about now is pre-Prince of Persia, but of course the reason that I opened up the archives is because I was trying to find images from the Prince of Persia era that I could use in publishing the illustrated journals. So here is one of the first sketches I found about the Prince of Persia game design. Does that come through? Yeah. So there's a lot of ideas for traps, only a few of which made it into the game. Some of them did. There's the portcullis, the trapdoor, and the falling floor. I think pretty much all of the others on this page didn't make it. But that was sort of the process. I noticed in going through the sketches that I had 10 times more ideas that I wanted to do and thought I was going to do, and that the finished game of Prince of Persia is actually about 10% of that, just through necessity. For one thing, because it was only 64K of memory, but also if I tried to put all of this in, I'd probably still be programming it today. Let's see, got a few minutes more. I'm just going to sort of talk through the rotoscoping 2.0 process, because this was 5 years later. It's this year, by the way, is the 30th anniversary of Prince of Persia. It's also less well known, the 35th anniversary of So there were actually 5 years elapsed between those two projects. And during that time, I finished college. I had a bunch of other stuff that I wanted to do, but the Apple II itself didn't change. So by the time Prince of Persia began, I was using an old machine. The Apple II was getting a bit long in the tooth, but that was the machine I knew how to program. And again, if I'd known that it was going to take me 4 years to make the game, maybe I would have rethought that and done it on a different platform. But as usual, at pretty much every project at every point in my career, I thought I would be done, and I'd be in beta in about 6 months and shipped by Christmas. That was kind of the Prince of Persia timeline every year. So here's this is sort of the implementation of those rough sketches that we just saw. I translated it into the 40-byte width of the Apple II screen. I divided the screen into 10 blocks, and each to sort of simulate 3D, each block had sections. There's little pieces that got OR'd, and then some got masks that got anded on top of them to kind of do the masking for when the character climbed up. There were no sprites on the Apple II. All of this is, it's all done manually with either exclusive OR or with the bytes mapping directly to the screen, and then using page flipping to make it not flicker. So this is the structure. Now for the animation, this is 1985 that I started. Since Super 8 had kind of been supplanted by the first home video cameras. So I actually had a camera that could shoot VHS, and I videotaped my brother running and jumping in our high school parking lot. This is kind of the Muybridge sheet that I came up with. Now, just to explain what this is, each of these is a 35mm still picture of a video freeze frame. So I set up a camera on a tripod, took a picture of the screen, did a frame advance, took a picture, and then sort of scotch taped them all together. Now the contrast wasn't enough, so I used a black magic marker and some whiteout to make the contrast sharp enough that it would actually register when I pointed a second video camera, a black and white video camera, on an animation stand that was plugged into this card that was made by a company in the UK, which enabled digitization of one single static frame. It wasn't like a real-time video digitization. It was actually this frame, or rather, here's the Xerox copy of it to make the contrast absolutely clear. This is what I put on the animation stand and pointed the camera at. And so this then scanned into the Apple II. I then spent the next few days cutting out each frame and using the evolved version of my my little Photoshop tool, pixel editor, to create the animation. So that's the Rotoscope 2.0 process in a nutshell. I'm just going to show one last picture here, which is taken at the end of the Prince of Persia development. This is 4 years later. This is 1989, and this is actually the only picture I have of my office and my development setup. So, looking at it now and noticing certain details, notice I had 2 Apple computers. That was huge. That was something I'd never thought of until I got to Burgerbund and realized that such a thing was possible. But I had one Apple to play test the game and the other one to hold the source code and the assembler. So this meant that I could actually, instead of having to wipe out the computer's memory every time I tested it, probably it would crash and I'd have to reboot the computer and then, restart everything. I was able to keep the code in memory and then just test it on the other machine by flipping and switching the floppy in between 2 different disk drives that I had stacked one on top of the other. They're kind of hidden by the monitor there, but that was a big technical advance. And you can see in the taped up to the wall are the kind of mementos of all the different motion strips of the different animated sequences. That's cheap decoration along that line. So these are the few of the things that I've pulled out of the archive as I'm going through it and pulling out the images. And so the timeline for this book, I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a version of the book within the next 2 months, by September, which is pretty much 30 years to the day after the Apple II version of Prince of Persia went into QA. And then we can ship it, have printed books in the spring, hopefully around the time of PAX. And that'll coincide, if we can, with the 30th anniversary of shipping the PC version of Prince of Persia. So if we have a couple of minutes left, I can happy to answer any questions or comments that any of this has sparked.
Go ahead.
So for me, the key game of yours is Karateka, because from Karateka you can see, oh yeah, this is the guy who made Prince of Persia, that makes sense, and then from Prince of Persia, on and on in the rest of your career. But then if you looked before Karateka, you saw Death Bounce, and then you said, oh, this guy's going to make Karateka. You say, well, I don't believe that. It seems like from Death Bounce to Karateka was a huge jump in ambition, and maybe you knew some technical things, but for me that was just a huge jump, and for a teenager to make that was very impressive. And so my question is, did you, inspired a little bit by Choplifters, say, okay, I'm going to lift my game and attempt this much more ambitious project? Or was it more of something you kind of played around with karate and kind of got in too deep, but then were able to persist and accomplish it?
I think it was the first. I think Choplifter impressed me so much that, and I kind of felt like I'd wasted the last 2 years sort of copying the previous year's success, and I realized that I was going to always be like 1 year behind at that rate. Choplifter struck me as completely original. It was like no other game. And so I thought, well, that's the thing to do. Here's someone who imagined something that nobody else had done. He went off and did it. And so that's what I need to do. If I want to do something that's going to still stand the test of time 2 years from now, I've got to, reach a little bit beyond my comfort zone. It's got to be more ambitious. And in fact, that meant that it took longer. But yeah, it was it was conceived as something. I wasn't quite sure, what it was going to be. I was drawing influences from a lot of different things too. From silent film was a big one. I was in college at this time taking film classes, and I was kind of struck by the way the early films had to invent a cinematic language. D.W. Griffith doing cross-cutting. The idea that the close-up had an emotional impact that was different. It was not an exact. It didn't have an equivalent in theatrical plays, which is what the early films had to be based on. So I thought games now are kind of like cinema 100 years ago. Like everything remains to be done. So the things like copying things like cross-cutting and the wipes, and it's kind of seems a little silly to evoke Kurosawa, whose films are so spectacular, and then you see the little wipe on the Apple II, and it's almost touching. But still, it was just trying to get a cinematic feeling in there. And I kept the journal during the making of Karateka too, and it's kind of all in there. The ups and downs. It taking so much longer than I thought, and then questioning it, and then not having time to work on it because I was also taking a full courseload at college at the same time, and then trying to work on it really hard over the summer and finish it, and then being despondent when the summer ended and I still hadn't finished it, and I had to take the unfinished game back to school with me.
Well, thank you.
So you've released the source code for Prince of Persia, and I'm just wondering if you have found any of the source code for Karateka either on disk or printouts.
I'm not sure you want to see the source code for Karateka.
Yes.
You know, the source code for Karateka was never lost. I think it was more that I wasn't proud of it, so I never really made an effort to find it. It's probably at the Strong. It's probably on one of those disks. I think, you know, I'll find out probably in the course of doing this research. But it's not good code. I just want to set expectations there. It's, I mean, it's, by the time of Prince of Persia, I had learned from everything that I did wrong on Karateka, and I really made an effort to kind of structure it more cleanly, to be modular. And because remember, when I did Karateka, I still had not met any professional programmers. I was in college. Everything was just sort of stuff I'd picked up on my own. Then I got to Broderbund, and I met programmers like Roland Gustafson, David Snyder, and Dan Berlin, who really knew programming. And so I just soaked it up. And I kind of felt like, you know, I've just been kind of flailing in the dark all this time. There actually is there's a body of knowledge about how to do this correctly, and they've all learned it. And I don't, so I was just like picking up the tips that I could, but I kind of felt like everything I'd done up to that point, it's a miracle that it was working at all. You know, Karateka, I got it working, we shipped it, got most of the bugs out. Then I never wanted to look at that code again. So, which is why I'm doubly impressed that somehow you managed to dig into it and get it working with 2 players. That's I shudder at the thought of opening up that code again.
Did you consider a 2-player version?
No, I didn't at the time. And one reason was that in order to make, like, the challenge of the fighting was kind of based on the fact that the enemies were operating at half speed to, you know, to give the player time to react. So you can sort of see what the enemy is starting to do and then react. So if it's 2 players, that have to be at the same speed. So, but you've done it, so I'm curious to see how that works.
Where's Charles? Come and say hi.
Oh, hi, I'm the one that hacked Karateka. I'm Charles.
You see him?
Hey.
I'm going to turn you briefly over that way.
Okay, there you go. Hello.
Hi. And I'm impressed.
Yeah, the patch was very small, but I had to find just the right place to put it, and you made it a challenge by not having the source code available, so I had to go in through the binary. Yeah, the interaction between the players is still a little janky. I'd love to make it a more official version.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough because if they're both going full speed, it's like there's not. I mean, it's only like 8 frames a second, if that. Right? It's not really enough time to see the tell and to react. So it almost becomes like a game of rock, scissors, paper, right?
Yeah.
I have a question.
I don't know. I'd love to see. I wish we had enough bandwidth that I could see it here, but.
You can play it on archive.org.
Okay, I'll check that out.
I have a question from the stream. What's the story behind the upside down version of Karateka?
Yeah. So okay, this was an example of one of the things that I didn't. It had never occurred to me when I was in New York learning how to program to use a lookup table. Like all of the animation, like on the Apple II, was slowed down by the fact that the screen memory was mapped in this really arbitrary, weird way. I mean, there was a reason for it, but it basically meant that if you had the X and Y coordinates that you wanted to blast a byte to on the screen, you had to do this whole calculation that took many, many cycles to figure out what the memory address was. And so I found a routine somewhere, you know, it was in the Red Book or in some magazine, and I used that, and I was using that for everything. And then when I got to Broderbund, it was Roland Gustafson, you know, a better Apple II programmer than I ever came near to being. You know, he knew everything about how the disks worked, and he did all the copy protection for all of Broderbund's games. He said, "Why don't you just use a lookup table?" What's that? So he said that you just take a block of memory, allocate it to listing all of the memory addresses, and then you just look it up. It takes 2 cycles. Yeah. I mean, it used a chunk of memory. So instead of having 48K and now I only have 44 to fit the entire program into. But it was worth it because suddenly the animation was like 10 times faster. So one thing about a lookup table is that if you invert the lookup table, automatically the game starts playing upside down. It's the easiest thing in the world. So we did that for fun. And then it was either Roland or I said, we should put this on the reverse side of the disk. So if you accidentally put the disk in upside down, which happens sometimes to everybody, instead of giving you an error, the game just boots normally and plays upside down. And we figured that if, that would happen to some people, mathematically, and that some people might, be so innocent that they would not realize what they'd done. They'd think maybe their monitor was upside down, they couldn't figure it out, and then they would call Broderbund tech support. So that the tech support guy would have the sublime joy of saying, well, sir, check the disk, you might have put it in upside down. And then the customer would turn the disk over, reboot, it would play normally. He would thank the tech support guy and hang up, believing for the rest of his life that that's how software worked, that if you put a disk in upside down, it would play upside down. So we had this idea, and we chuckled over it a bit, but we didn't think that Broderbund would ever agree to do it because obviously the cost of goods was a factor, and duplicating a disk on both sides, I don't know, it was an extra 20 cents or something like that, because disks were copied manually. Like Broderbund had a production line in the warehouse, and the person who was duplicating the disks had to duplicate it, then pull out the disk, put it back in, duplicate it again, and then put it in the box. So it meant more time, it meant more labor costs. It was clearly just a waste of money. So we didn't think Doug would ever say yes to it. But we went into his office, we proposed this. Doug said, sure, let's do it. Those were the days.
So being that that was all done manually, did anyone accidentally copy the B-side onto the top of the A-side by accident?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
Did anyone, being that it was all done manually, did anyone copy it reversed, like put the B-side on the A-side?
Oh, like any duplication errors?
Yeah.
And, I don't know. I guess it could have happened. I don't know of any.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think this should be our last question, probably.
Yeah. So Karateka led to Prince of Persia. Prince of Persia led to Assassin's Creed. What is and we've seen modern takes on Karateka with the iOS game and Prince of Persia with the Sands of Time. What are the future for your franchises?
My gosh, that's too big a question to answer in a few minutes. But I'm working on a lot of stuff, but probably the best one to end on is the one that's going to come up next, which is, the Making of Prince of Persia book. And that's, it's not a game, but at least it's a way to kind of, celebrate the 30th anniversary of the original game. And it's going to be, and it'll be out this year. There'll be other announcements coming behind that, but for now, we'll just, I better just stick to that one.
Thank you.
And you can get the info and the updates about it at jordanmechner.com/pop30, POP30.
And you'll be at PAX East signing those?
That's the plan. If that plan changes, I'll update it on the website.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks everybody. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Jordan. It has been a real pleasure having you.